92% of the things you worry about never happen. This is not speculation or motivational nonsense. This is data from research studies on chronic worriers, people who track their anxieties and then measure outcomes. 92%, which means the vast majority of human suffering is self-inflicted, happening not in the world but in the theater of the mind. Seneca knew this 2,000 years ago without studies or statistics. He wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality," and in that single sentence, he diagnosed the core pathology of human existence. We are meaning-making machines trapped in bodies that evolved for survival, not happiness. Our brains are wired to scan for threats, to imagine worst-case scenarios, to replay past failures and project future disasters. This made sense when threats were immediate and physical: predators, starvation, tribal conflict. But now we live in the safest era in human history, and our threat detection system has nowhere to go, so it turns inward. It manufactures fears from shadows. It builds catastrophes from possibilities. It tortures us with futures that will never arrive and pasts that cannot be changed. You know this experience intimately. The conversation you need to have that you rehearse 100 times in your mind, each version worse than the last. The email you wait for that becomes, in your imagination, a rejection letter that destroys your career. The health symptom you notice that spirals into a terminal diagnosis before you even see a doctor. The relationship conflict that becomes, in your mind, the end of everything you have built. You suffer through all of this before any of it happens, and in most cases, none of it happens the way you imagined. This is the invisible war that destroys more lives than any external enemy. Not the battles you actually face, but the ones you fight in your head. Not the pain you experience, but the pain you anticipate. Not the losses you suffer, but the losses you imagine. Seneca watched this happen to the most powerful people in Rome. Senators paralyzed by fear of conspiracies that did not exist. Merchants who made themselves sick worrying about shipwrecks that never came. Soldiers who suffered more in anticipation of battle than in battle itself. Nothing has changed. The circumstances are different. The pattern is identical. The modern world has made this worse, not better. We have created technologies that feed our imaginative suffering like fuel on a fire. Social media shows us curated versions of other people's lives, and we imagine ourselves failing by comparison. News media broadcasts worst-case scenarios 24 hours a day, and we imagine those scenarios happening to us. Our phones deliver a constant stream of potential threats, and our nervous systems cannot tell the difference between a notification and a genuine emergency. We are drowning in imagined suffering while actual suffering, the kind that requires real response, gets lost in the noise. Seneca was not a man untouched by real suffering. He faced exile, poverty, political persecution, and ultimately execution. He knew the difference between imagined pain and actual pain intimately. And what he discovered was this: the imagined pain was always worse. The anticipation of exile was more agonizing than exile itself. The fear of losing wealth was more tormenting than actual poverty. The dread of death was more suffocating than the moment of dying. Reality, even when harsh, has limits. Imagination has none. This is why people who survived terrible circumstances often report that the experience was not as bad as they feared. Not because the circumstance was easy, but because their imagination had made it impossible. Cancer patients who feared they could not handle treatment discover reserves of strength they did not know they had. People who lose jobs they thought defined them discover new paths they never would have explored. Relationships that end in ways we dread often lead to freedom we could not have imagined. The suffering we anticipate is almost always worse than the suffering we experience. But here is what makes this particularly cruel. While you are busy suffering in imagination, you are not present for your actual life. The moment happening right now, which might be peaceful, ordinary, even pleasant, is invisible to you because you are haunted by a future that has not arrived or a past that has already gone. Seneca wrote, "The mind that is anxious about future events is miserable. Not will be miserable when those events happen. Is miserable now, in the present, poisoning the only moment you actually have." Think about yesterday. How much of it did you spend worried about things that had not happened yet? How much mental energy did you burn imagining scenarios, preparing for conflicts, rehearsing failures? Now think about what actually happened yesterday. How much of your imagined suffering materialized into real suffering? The ratio is absurd, and yet you will wake up tomorrow and do it again. We all will, unless we learn what Seneca spent his life teaching. The Stoic approach to this is not positive thinking. It is not affirmations or pretending everything is fine. The Stoics were unflinchingly realistic about life's difficulties. What they refused to do was add imaginary difficulties on top of real ones. They refused to suffer twice, once in imagination and once in reality. They trained themselves to stay with what is actually happening, not what might happen, not what happened before, but what is true right now. This training is not natural. Your brain will resist it because your brain believes that worrying is productive. Your brain thinks that if it can imagine every possible threat and prepare for every possible disaster, you will be safe. This is a lie. Chronic worry does not prepare you for difficulty. It exhausts you before difficulty arrives. It wastes the energy and clarity you will need when real challenges come. It is like a soldier who fights invisible enemies all night and then has nothing left when the actual battle begins at dawn. Seneca observed this in himself constantly. Even as one of the most disciplined philosophical minds in history, he caught himself sliding into imaginary suffering. The difference between him and most people was not that he never worried. It was that he noticed when he was worrying and had tools to return to reality. He would ask himself a simple question: is this happening now, or am I making it happen in my mind? That question, asked honestly, dissolves most suffering immediately. Try it right now with whatever worry is sitting in your mind. Is the thing you are anxious about happening in this present moment, or are you projecting into a future that does not exist yet? If you are worried about a difficult conversation tomorrow, the conversation is not happening now. Right now, you are safe. If you are replaying a mistake from last week, that moment is over. Right now, you are not in that moment. The suffering you feel is not coming from reality. It is coming from your imagination's recreation of reality, and that recreation is almost always worse than the original. Before we go deeper into how to escape this trap, I want to ask you something directly. Do you want to keep living this way? Do you want to spend your finite time on this planet suffering through events that never happen? Because if you are tired of it, if you are ready to learn how the Stoics handled this, then subscribe to this channel. We do not make content to help you feel better temporarily. We make content to help you think differently permanently. This is practical philosophy for people who are done with imaginary suffering and ready to face only real challenges. Understanding that you suffer more in imagination than reality is not enough. Knowledge without application is just entertainment. The Stoics were obsessed with practice, with daily techniques that retrained the mind away from imaginary suffering and toward present reality. Seneca did not just write about this principle. He lived it through specific methods that anyone can apply. These are not complex. They are simple, but simple does not mean easy. The first practice is what Seneca called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. This sounds like it contradicts everything we just discussed, like it would increase imaginary suffering rather than decrease it. But the technique is precise and powerful. Instead of letting your mind run wild with vague catastrophic fantasies, you deliberately imagine worst-case scenarios in a structured, time-limited way. You sit down, pick a specific fear, and imagine it happening in detail. Then you imagine yourself handling it. Here is why this works. Most of our imaginary suffering comes from unexamined fears that lurk in the background of consciousness. They are vague, formless, huge. When you bring them into the light and examine them directly, they shrink. When you imagine yourself in the scenario and see that you would find a way through it, the fear loses its power. Seneca would imagine losing all his wealth. Then he would imagine how he would live with nothing. He realized he would survive, adapt, perhaps even find unexpected freedom. The fear could no longer torment him because he had already faced it and survived it in imagination. The key is doing this intentionally, with a time limit. Set aside 10 minutes. Pick one fear. Imagine it fully. Imagine yourself handling it. Then close the exercise and return to the present. You are not rehearsing the fear endlessly. You are inoculating yourself against it. Like a vaccine that exposes you to a small dose of a virus to build immunity, premeditatio malorum exposes you to a controlled dose of your fear to build resilience. Do this regularly with your recurring fears, and they lose their ability to ambush you with imaginary suffering. The second practice is ruthless focus on what you can control. This is the cornerstone of Stoic philosophy, repeated by every major Stoic thinker. Epictetus taught it as the foundational principle. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of it daily. Seneca built his entire approach to suffering around it. The principle is simple. You control your thoughts, your actions, your responses. You do not control outcomes, other people, external events. All imaginary suffering comes from trying to control things you cannot control. When you worry about whether someone will like you, you are trying to control their thoughts. When you stress about whether you will get the job, you are trying to control their decision. When you agonize over whether your project will succeed, you are trying to control the market. None of these things are within your control. You can influence them with your actions, but you cannot control them. And every moment you spend trying to control the uncontrollable is a moment spent suffering in imagination. The practice is this. When you notice yourself worrying, pause and ask, what part of this is within my control? You cannot control whether they hire you, but you can control how well you prepare for the interview. You cannot control whether the relationship works out, but you can control how honestly you communicate. You cannot control whether people approve of your work, but you can control the quality of the work itself. Shift all your energy to what you control, and the imaginary suffering dissolves. What remains is real work, real action, real presence. This is harder than it sounds because we have been trained to believe that worrying is caring. We think that if we stop worrying about outcomes, we stop caring about them. This is false. You can care deeply about something while accepting that you do not control it. In fact, you can care more effectively because your energy goes into your actual influence rather than into imaginary scenarios. A parent who worries constantly about their child is not helping the child. A parent who focuses their energy on what they can actually do for their child is. The third practice is what Seneca called negative visualization, but we can think of it as gratitude for what is. Most of your imaginary suffering revolves around losing things you have or not getting things you want. Seneca would regularly imagine losing the things he valued most: his friends, his health, his freedom, his life. Not to be morbid, but to remember that he did not own these things permanently. They were on loan. This practice made him deeply grateful for them while he had them and prepared for their eventual loss. Try this tonight before you sleep. Think of 3 things in your life you take for granted. Imagine waking up tomorrow and they are gone. Your health, your home, a person you love. Sit with that imagination briefly. Let yourself feel what that loss would mean. Then open your eyes and return to reality where you still have these things. The gratitude you feel will be real and deep, not the shallow gratitude of positive thinking exercises. And when you are deeply grateful for what you have, you spend less time suffering over what you might lose or what you do not have. The fourth practice is present moment anchoring. This is the most direct antidote to imaginary suffering. Your imagination can only create suffering about the past or future. It cannot create suffering about the present moment unless something is actually wrong in the present moment. So when you catch yourself in imaginary suffering, bring your attention aggressively back to now. What do you see right now? What do you hear? What do you feel physically? Not emotionally, physically. The temperature, the sensation of breathing, the pressure of your body against the chair. Seneca would do this by focusing on his breath, by feeling his feet on the ground, by looking at the sky or a tree and really seeing it. These are not mystical practices. They are circuit breakers for runaway imagination. Your brain cannot simultaneously be fully present in sensory reality and lost in imaginary suffering. The two states are incompatible. The more you practice returning to the present moment, the less time you spend suffering in imagination. It is a skill, like any skill. It improves with repetition. The fifth practice is reframing the narrative. Most imaginary suffering comes from the story you tell about what things mean. You do not just imagine bad outcomes. You imagine what those outcomes say about you, what they prove, what they mean for your future. These narratives are almost always catastrophically negative and wildly inaccurate. Seneca would catch himself in these narratives and consciously rewrite them with questions. I imagine I will fail this test becomes, what if I pass, or what if failing leads somewhere better? I imagine they think I am incompetent becomes, what evidence do I have of this, or what if their opinion does not define my worth? I imagine this setback ruins everything becomes, what if this is a redirection toward something I cannot see yet? You are not being naive. You are being balanced. Your imagination already runs wild with negative scenarios. Balance it by imagining neutral or positive possibilities with equal vividness. The sixth practice, and perhaps the most powerful, is time boxing your worry. Seneca understood that you cannot simply stop worrying through force of will. Suppression does not work, but you can contain it. Set aside 15 minutes each day as designated worry time. During that time, worry intentionally about everything on your mind. Write it all down. Imagine it all. Then, when the 15 minutes ends, close the notebook and move on. If worries arise outside that time, tell yourself, I will think about this during worry time. Your brain learns that worry has a place and a time, and it stops hijacking your entire day. These practices are not one-time exercises. They are daily disciplines. Seneca did them until the day he died. Marcus Aurelius did them throughout his reign as emperor. These were not men free from imaginary suffering. They were men who had tools to recognize it and return to reality. The goal is not to never worry. The goal is to catch yourself worrying and have a method to return to what is actually happening. As we pass the midpoint of this exploration, I want to remind you that this knowledge means nothing without practice. If you are serious about ending imaginary suffering, subscribe to this channel and commit to applying one technique each week. We are building a community of people who refuse to suffer unnecessarily, who face real challenges without adding imaginary ones. This is not easy work, but it is the only work that matters. Let us go deeper into why imaginary suffering is so seductive, why we return to it even when we know it serves no purpose. Understanding the mechanism helps you recognize when it is happening and gives you leverage to interrupt it. Seneca observed that people actually prefer imaginary suffering to present reality in many cases. This seems insane, but once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Imaginary suffering gives you the illusion of control. When you rehearse conversations in your mind, you feel like you are preparing. When you imagine disasters, you feel like you are protecting yourself. When you replay past failures, you feel like you are learning. But you are not. You are avoiding. You are avoiding the vulnerability of being present. You are avoiding the uncertainty of real action. You are avoiding the possibility that you might fail even with your best effort. Imaginary suffering is a shield against reality, and shields are comfortable even when they are prisons. Seneca saw this in wealthy Romans who had everything but could not enjoy anything because they were terrified of losing it. Their imaginary suffering about potential loss was worse than actual poverty would have been. He saw it in powerful politicians who achieved every ambition but remained miserable because they constantly imagined their power being taken away. Their imaginary suffering about hypothetical betrayal was worse than actual betrayal would have been. The pattern is universal. The more you have, the more you can imagine losing. The more you achieve, the more you can imagine failing. This is why presence is a discipline, not a destination. You do not arrive at a place where imaginary suffering stops happening. You build a practice of noticing it and choosing differently. Seneca had to do this daily, even after decades of philosophical training. He would catch himself worrying about shipments that had not arrived, students who had not written back, political situations that might deteriorate. Each time, he applied the same question: is this happening now? Each time, the answer was no. Each time, he returned to the present. The modern trap is that we have built an entire culture around imaginary suffering. We call it planning, preparation, being responsible. We praise people who think ahead, who anticipate problems, who never get caught off guard. But there is a massive difference between prudent planning and chronic worry. Planning happens in a specific, time-limited way with a clear action outcome. Worry is endless, circular, and produces no action. Most of what we call planning is actually just socially acceptable imaginary suffering. You see this everywhere. People who spend hours researching health conditions they do not have. People who obsess over retirement scenarios 40 years away while ignoring their present life. People who cannot enjoy a vacation because they are imagining everything that might go wrong at work while they are gone. People who cannot be intimate in relationships because they are imagining the relationship ending. This is not prudence. This is suffering in imagination, and we have normalized it to the point where presence seems irresponsible. Seneca would say the truly irresponsible thing is wasting your life suffering through events that never happen while missing the life that is actually happening. He wrote, "Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements if it were all well invested. But when it is wasted in heedless luxury and spent on no good activity, we are forced at last by death's final constraint to realize that it has passed away before we knew it was passing." Replace heedless luxury with imaginary suffering, and the truth remains. How much of your life have you already lost to imaginary suffering? How many present moments have you been physically present for but mentally absent from? How many conversations where you were thinking about the past or future instead of listening? How many meals you did not taste because you were worried about tomorrow? How many sunsets you did not see because you were replaying yesterday? This is not philosophical abstraction. This is your actual life being consumed by imagination. The counter-argument people raise is that imaginary suffering serves an evolutionary purpose. Our ancestors who worried about predators survived to pass on their genes. Those who did not worry got eaten. This is true, but it misses the crucial context. Our ancestors worried about immediate, concrete threats. A rustling in the bushes. A rival tribe approaching. Threats they could see and respond to. Modern imaginary suffering is nothing like this. You are not worrying about immediate concrete threats. You are worrying about abstract possibilities, social scenarios, future outcomes you cannot see or control. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. When you imagine a catastrophic scenario, your body responds as if it is happening. Cortisol floods your system, your heart rate increases, your digestion shuts down, your immune system weakens. You are putting your body through real physiological stress for imaginary reasons. Do this chronically, and you create real health problems from imaginary suffering. The suffering becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Seneca saw this play out in his own health. He struggled with respiratory problems his entire life, made worse by the anxiety and stress he carried. He learned that managing his mind directly improved his physical condition. When he caught himself in imaginary suffering and returned to the present, his breathing eased. When he let worry run unchecked, his symptoms worsened. The connection between imaginary suffering and real physical pain became undeniable. Modern medicine has confirmed what Seneca learned through experience. Chronic stress from imaginary threats creates measurable damage to your body. So how do you break the addiction to imaginary suffering? Because that is what it is, an addiction. Your brain gets a neurochemical reward from worry. It feels productive. It feels like you are doing something. Breaking this addiction requires the same approach as breaking any addiction: awareness, substitution, and repetition. First, you must become aware of when you are suffering in imagination. This sounds obvious, but most people are so lost in their thoughts they do not even realize they are doing it. Set alarms on your phone 3 times a day that just say, "Where are you?" When the alarm goes off, ask yourself, am I present in this moment, or am I suffering about something that is not happening now? Second, you need a substitute behavior. You cannot just stop imaginary suffering without replacing it with something else. Seneca replaced it with present moment observation. When he caught himself worrying, he would describe his immediate environment in detail. The texture of the cloth he was wearing, the temperature of the air, the sound of voices nearby. This trained his attention to stay with what is real instead of fleeing into imagination. You need your own substitute. Some people use breath counting. Some use physical sensation scanning. Some use gratitude listing. Find what works for you and practice it relentlessly. Third, repetition. You will fail at this constantly at first. You will spend entire days lost in imaginary suffering before you remember to check. That is normal. The practice is not about perfection. The practice is about frequency. How quickly can you notice you have drifted into imagination and return to reality? At first, it might take hours. Then it takes an hour. Then 20 minutes. Then 5. Eventually, you catch yourself within seconds. The gap between drifting off and returning shrinks with practice. This is the skill you are building. Seneca practiced this for decades and still caught himself drifting. The mind's tendency toward imaginary suffering never fully disappears. What changes is your relationship to it. You stop identifying with every worried thought. You stop believing that worry equals care. You stop mistaking imaginary preparation for actual readiness. You become someone who lives primarily in reality, occasionally visits imagination when it is useful, and always knows the difference. The freedom this creates is difficult to describe until you experience it. It is not that your life becomes free of problems. It is that you face only real problems as they arrive instead of suffering through phantom problems that never materialize. The energy you were wasting on imaginary suffering becomes available for actual living. Your relationships deepen because you are present for them. Your work improves because you are not distracted by phantom fears. Your health stabilizes because your nervous system is not constantly flooded with stress hormones for imaginary reasons. Now we arrive at the final and perhaps most challenging aspect of Seneca's rule: learning to face real suffering without adding imaginary layers. Because the truth is, life contains actual suffering. Real loss, real pain, real disappointment. The Stoic approach is not to deny this or pretend it does not hurt. It is to face what is real without making it worse through imagination. This is where most people struggle, because when real suffering arrives, the temptation to amplify it through imagination is overwhelming. Seneca faced this directly when he was exiled to Corsica. He lost his position, his influence, his home, his connection to friends and family. This was real suffering, not imaginary. But he noticed that the actual experience of exile was manageable. What made it unbearable were the imaginary layers he added. Imagining he would never return, imagining his reputation being destroyed, imagining a future of permanent isolation. When he stripped away those imaginary layers and dealt only with the present reality of exile, he found he could bear it. More than bear it, he used it productively, writing some of his most important works during this period. This is the crucial distinction. Real suffering requires real response. Imaginary suffering requires no response because nothing is actually happening. But we rarely separate the two. Something difficult happens, and immediately our imagination begins adding catastrophic layers. You lose your job, and before you have even processed that loss, you are imagining homelessness, failure, permanent unemployment. Someone you love gets a serious diagnosis, and before you know the details, you are imagining their death, your grief, your inability to handle it. The real suffering is difficult enough. The imaginary suffering makes it impossible. The Stoic practice for this is radical acceptance of what is coupled with refusal to accept what is not yet. When Seneca learned he was being exiled, he accepted that fully. He did not waste energy denying it, resenting it, or imagining it was not happening. It was happening, but he refused to accept the imaginary futures his mind tried to create. He stayed with the present moment of exile and dealt with each challenge as it actually arose. This is not resignation. This is realism. Resignation is passive. Realism is active engagement with what is actually happening. Marcus Aurelius practiced this throughout his reign as emperor. He faced constant real suffering, plague, war, betrayal, family tragedy. His private writings show how he would separate real from imaginary suffering. When he wrote about his son's death, he acknowledged the real pain but refused to add imaginary layers about what it meant or what might happen next. He stayed with the present reality of his grief, felt it fully, and then continued to fulfill his responsibilities. This was not cold. This was clear. He suffered only what needed to be suffered, nothing more. The technique they both used was a simple question. What is actually happening right now, stripped of all interpretation and projection? Try this with any current difficulty. If you are sick, what is actually happening? You have symptoms. You have a diagnosis. These are real. Everything else, the imagined progression, the feared outcomes, the projected limitations, these are additions from imagination. Face the real without accepting the imaginary as equally real. This creates space to actually deal with what is happening instead of drowning in what might happen. Another layer of this is refusing to catastrophize through comparison. Much of our imaginary suffering comes from comparing our present difficulty to worst-case scenarios we have heard about. Someone has a minor health scare and immediately thinks of the worst case they read about online. Someone faces a career setback and immediately thinks of people who never recovered. Seneca would stop this pattern by asking, "What is happening to me? Not what happened to someone else." Your situation is unique. Their outcome is not your destiny. Deal with your reality, not with composite fears built from other people's experiences. The Stoics also practiced what we might call worst-case completion. When something bad happens, your imagination immediately begins building catastrophic narratives about what this will lead to. Instead of trying to suppress these narratives, complete them. Follow them all the way to the absolute worst case, and then imagine yourself surviving even that. Seneca did this when facing his eventual execution. He imagined the worst possible way it could happen, imagined himself facing it with dignity, and realized that even death itself was manageable if faced with philosophical clarity. This did not eliminate the reality of death. It eliminated the imaginary terror that made death worse than it needed to be. For most of the difficulties you face, the worst case is not death. It is ego death, the death of how you see yourself or how you want others to see you. You fear job loss not because you will actually starve,